The desert dust rose in thick clouds as the black horse galloped, its hooves pounding hard on the dry ground. John Black, known in the West as the Devil, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where a small town began to take shape, like an oasis in the middle of nowhere. He had traveled for days, fleeing from what he could no longer bear, the weight of his own conscience, but at the same time, something was drawing him back to San Eladio. A force he couldn't comprehend. It was the end of the line, and he knew it. In recent years, his name had become synonymous with fear. Thief, murderer, traitor, the words echoed in every corner of the towns and villages he passed through. For a long time, John had believed there was nothing left but the emptiness he himself had built. But looking at the town ahead, a strange feeling overcame him. He was back, but he didn't know if it was to die or to start anew. San Eladio, a small, dusty town with wooden houses and dirt streets, seemed peaceful at first glance. But John knew that every town had its secrets, and San Eladio was no different. The men he had left behind, the outlaws and gunslingers with whom he had once been a part, were probably still around. The idea that John's past could be forgotten was something almost impossible to believe. However, what surprised him most was the fact that he didn't even know the reason for his return. Something was calling him, something he couldn't understand. He dismounted from his horse at the entrance of the town, and the sound of leather creaking as he moved drew some gazes towards him. The faces at the windows disappeared as quickly as they appeared, and the sound of conversations ceased for a moment. John looked around, his eyes heavy with experience, having seen what man is capable of. But he didn't look at the people. He was searching for something more, something he knew he could find there. The town sheriff, Teddy Hawk, was on the corner, watching John with a cynical gaze. Hawk knew John's name all too well, and the very sight of the man there, so close to his town, made him uneasy. He was no longer the outlaw he once feared. No, now the fear came from what a man like John Black could do to the life of a peaceful town. The Devil had never left anyone in peace, and no one trusted an outsider. But it was at the moment John passed through the main square that he saw Abigail for the first time. She stood in front of the small church, coordinating a group of children. The wind lifted her simple skirt, and the sunlight reflected off her golden hair. She didn't see John immediately, but he watched her intently. Abigail was not like the women he was used to knowing. She didn't look at him with fear or disdain. On the contrary, she seemed focused, as if nothing could shake her. John approached, slowly passing by the group of children playing around her. Abigail then noticed him. Their eyes met, and for a moment he saw something different. It wasn't hatred, as he had expected, nor indifference, as he was accustomed to seeing in others. There was curiosity, perhaps a bit of apprehension, but something more, something he couldn't name. She was the first to approach, her steps firm, as if she were ready to face anything that came her way. "You are John Black, aren't you?" she asked with a calm yet firm voice. John stood still for a moment, surprised by her confidence. He had always been recognized by the fear he generated, but there, in that moment, she did not seem to fear anything. He simply nodded, speechless. "We don't have space for outlaws here," she continued, without anger but with raw honesty. "If you came here looking for trouble, it might be better to go back to where you came from. But if you are here for some other reason, the orphanage needs help. I'm not good at forgiving, but I can give you a chance to do something good if you want." John looked at her, his eyes hardened by pain and regret, but with a spark of something he had lost long ago, hope. He didn't know what that meant, but her offer struck him in an unusual way. No one had ever offered him something like that. A chance at redemption, something he thought was impossible. He didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her as she walked away, returning to the children who awaited her with the same serenity she maintained. But Abigail's words stayed with him. If you are here for some other reason, could it be that he still had a chance to change, to do what was right instead of what had been easy? John slowly turned away, lost in thought. as the sun set on the horizon. The town was still a mystery to him, but something inside him said he was where he was meant to be. And maybe, just maybe, it was possible to find some form of redemption, even for someone like him. The sun was already low in the sky, tinting the horizon with golden and red hues, when John passed through the small central square of San Eladio. He still didn't know what had brought him there. It wasn't just fate. It wasn't merely curiosity about that little town, lost in the desert. Something else was calling him, and he felt it deep in his soul. But what? He couldn't understand, and that feeling troubled him deeply. John Black's story is becoming even more intense and full of twists. If you are enjoying the journey of redemption and action, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any chapters of this incredible adventure. Together, we will find out if San Eladio can rise again, and if John will be able to overcome his greatest challenges. Like now and subscribe to follow the next episode of this epic tale of courage and transformation. As he crossed the square, his gaze landed on a familiar figure, Abigail. She was in the midst of a small crowd of children playing near the fountain, guiding them with the same calm and authority he had seen before. However, that afternoon, there was something different about her. The way she moved her arms, how the children looked at her with admiration, all of it indicated that she was more than just a maternal figure to those kids. She was, in fact, a pillar for everyone there. John, with his usual impassive expression, walked to the edge of the square, feeling the townsfolk's eyes on him. They watched him discreetly, some with fear, others with anger. He didn't care. What he feared most was not being recognized. He feared that something inside him might break, as if by looking at those people, he was seeing, for the first time in a long while, what he could have been, or what he could still be. Abigail seemed to be the only one who didn't look at him with contempt. She then approached John, her leather boots softly hitting the ground. She did not challenge him with harsh words, as he had expected. Instead, her blue eyes shone with a disconcerting tranquility, which, for him, felt like a kind of silent challenge. It was as if she knew exactly who he was and what he had done, yet was still willing to extend a hand. For John, this was something almost unthinkable. No woman had ever looked at him with such a lack of fear. "None. I saw you arrive," she said with a subtle smile, devoid of sarcasm but also without excessive warmth. "You are John Black, aren't you? The fugitive." The mention of his name, of who he had been, did not hit him as he had imagined. There was no revulsion or shouting, just a calm and unhurried observation. "I've heard about you," she added, her tone soft but heavy with meaning. "Some stories good, others not so much." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes heavy with a story that seemed impossible to tell in just a few words. Instead, he looked at her with a gaze that spoke of a life of solitude. "I heard that here people still believe in a second chance," he said, his voice hoarse, as if testing the waters, feeling the impact of his own words. She smiled slightly, more to herself than to him. "People here believe that when someone is willing to do good, everyone should give them a chance. Even those who have made great mistakes." She stepped closer, now nearer to John. He could feel the warmth of her presence, the freshness of her energy contrasting with his own coldness. She did not shy away from him, nor did she seem intimidated. "But what are you doing here, John Black? What do you want from us?" He fell silent for a moment, her question hitting hard in his mind. What did he want from San Eladio? What did he want from Abigail? He wanted much more than he could even admit to himself. But he knew he couldn't expect her to understand, not after everything he had done. "I don't know," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I guess I'm just trying to understand what more there is in this world, besides pain and death." Abigail watched him closely, her face impassive, but her eyes capturing every word, every expression he tried to hide. She did not offer him ready-made answers, as he had expected. Instead, she did something even more surprising. "The orphanage needs help," she said suddenly with conviction. "The town is full of problems." And yes, maybe you are the kind of man who can help, but please understand, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for those who still have something to offer. I'm doing it for them." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was not forgiving him. Not yet, but she was challenging him in a way that no one ever had before. She was offering him a chance to do something good, but without expectations, without believing he could save himself. It was almost as if she were inviting him to be more than his story, more than the reputation of a gunslinger he carried. But that also meant he would have to fight against who he was, and that seemed harder than any confrontation with outlaws or sheriffs. "So what do you want me to do?" John finally asked, the challenge in his voice now clearer, more direct. He knew that if he accepted the proposal, there would be no turning back. It wouldn't be easy, but he was tired of running. Abigail, without hesitation, replied, "I want you to help protect what is still good, what can be saved, and if you have the courage, help rebuild what has been lost." She gave him a brief nod and then stepped away without further words. John watched her go, feeling a whirlwind of conflicting emotions inside him. He didn't know what that proposal meant, but he knew it was something he couldn't ignore. He looked at the orphanage, at the group of children in the background, and for the first time, he felt that maybe there was something valuable in his life beyond his own survival. Abigail had challenged him to do something he had never imagined, to change, and somehow he knew that this would be the greatest challenge of all. Now let's delve into part 3 of the story, titled "The Past Doesn't Let Go." In this part, we will start to explore John's internal conflict as he begins to engage with the town and its people, especially Abigail. At the same time, the first external threats emerge. The return of his old enemy, Vince McCoy, creates rising tension, and the choice between crime and redemption begins to become clearer. The heat of the day was finally fading as John walked down the main street of San Eladio, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The children and residents were in their homes, winding down for the day, and the town was beginning to grow quiet again. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something he couldn't control. He had tried with all his might to bury the man he used to be. He tried to convince himself that it was possible to change. But as had always been the case in his life, the past always returned, ready to collect its dues. In the past few days, he had worked at the orphanage, helping with daily tasks, cleaning the stable and chopping firewood. He was busy, but his mind was elsewhere. Abigail's gaze always seemed to follow him, and increasingly he wondered if she believed, in some way, that he could truly change. But he had no answers to that. The town was beginning to see something different in him, but he knew the peace was temporary, as fragile as the dust that kicked up on the streets. Deep down, he felt he was waiting for an event, something that would pull him back to his former self, as if fate had a peculiar way of reclaiming what is its own. It was one afternoon, while he was in the small hall of the orphanage, helping the children fix the broken furniture, that the sound of hooves reached his ears. It wasn't the soft and comforting sound of the local horses that the townsfolk used for daily tasks. This sound had a different rhythm, heavy and relentless. A smell of gunpowder and sweat seemed to follow the echoes of the hooves. John stopped, his muscles tense, his eyes scanning the landscape around him. He didn't need to look to know who was approaching. At the end of the street, men began to appear, riding slowly toward the town. At the forefront was Vince McCoy, the man John hated most and, at the same time, feared the most. Vince was the kind of man who only spoke when he had something to say, and when he spoke, everyone knew his words were pure poison. He had been the leader of the gang of outlaws John had gotten involved with years before, and who eventually betrayed him. After the disastrous collapse of the group, John had fled to save his skin, but Vince, it seemed, had not forgotten the old friend. John felt a weight in his chest. He knew that the peace he was trying to build in San Eladio was about to be shattered. Vince saw no redemption in anyone, and the last thing he would do was let John walk away without collecting his debt. Even after all this time, Vince still felt the bitter taste of betrayal. And he knew that for John, the price would be high. Vince approached with his usual arrogance, his large hat partially covering his face. When the group stopped in front of the orphanage, the sound of hooves died down, but the air remained heavy with tension. "Well, well, if it isn't our friend John Black," Vince said with a crooked smile. "I thought I'd never see you again. Looks like you have a new life now, huh? Or maybe you've just been hiding." John didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to confront Vince there. He didn't want the children to see the man he had once walked with. But he knew violence was inevitable. "What do you want, McCoy?" he said, his voice low but firm. "I've left that life behind." Vince let out a mocking laugh. "Left? And you think anyone's going to believe that? Do you really think you can run away from what you are? Look around, John. This is just a facade. What you've done, what you are, can't be erased." He dismounted from his horse, his heavy steps on the dusty ground. "You know what you need to do, don't you? Come back to the gang. The town, the farmers, they stand no chance without us." John felt the anger begin to boil inside him, but he held it in check. He couldn't fall for the provocation, not anymore. The internal struggle was intense, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Abigail was right. He had a chance to do the right thing. However, the men beside Vince were armed to the teeth, and the thought of a direct confrontation was more real than ever. Before he could respond, Abigail appeared at the door of the orphanage, looking firmly at the group. "This is not the place for threats, McCoy. If you've come to ask for something, ask politely." She positioned herself defiantly, without hesitation. She knew John was torn between the desire to do the right thing and the call of the past. She understood that the whole town was in danger, but she also knew John had a choice to make, and she didn't want him to get lost in the darkness again. Vince looked at Abigail with a mocking smile. "And who are you, woman? The guardian of fugitives?" He was challenging her as if she were merely an insignificant obstacle. But looking at John, he saw the indecision in the man's eyes, and that amused him. "John, you've always been good with guns. The boys and I have missed your skills. The town won't last long without what's ours, and you know what I want. What do you think will happen to John Black and the town of San Eladio? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what you think about this journey of redemption and challenges. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next episodes and stay updated on everything coming your way. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you more incredible stories. Comment now and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. John was about to lose control. He knew he could no longer run away, could no longer ignore the fact that his past life was back to collect its dues. The town and everything he was trying to protect were about to be engulfed by the storm he had helped create. But looking at Abigail, something inside him ignited. She trusted him, even without knowing who he really was. She believed in change, in his change. He couldn't disappoint her. "What you want, McCoy, is something you won't have," John said in a grave voice, now standing tall, facing his former boss. "If you want war, then you'll have it, but don't think I'll join you again. That life is dead, and I killed it with my own hands." He paused, the weight of the words hanging between them. "Now go away, because if you don't, the whole town will see what happens when someone tries to disturb what is at peace." The silence that followed was deafening. Vince looked at John, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew John was lying to himself, trying to convince himself he could escape his fate. But McCoy also knew that war, in the end, wouldn't be avoided. He gave a sly smile. "You're going to regret this, Black. We always regret. See you later, friend." With a brusque gesture, Vince signaled to his men and walked away, but not without casting a threatening glance at John. They mounted their horses and left, the dust settling on the deserted street. John stood there, motionless, sweat dripping down his forehead, his body tense like a bowstring ready to snap. He knew that battle was just beginning. The night seemed calm, but there was something in the air that made the wind feel colder, the silence heavier. The streets of San Eladio were empty, except for a few townsfolk who hurried by with furtive glances and quick steps. Everyone knew what was coming. The threat of Vince McCoy and his men loomed over the town like a shadow. And John Black knew the storm was about to break. Since the encounter with Vince, he hadn't been able to sleep properly. The vision of his former boss's cruel face was still etched in his mind, and McCoy's words echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of who he really was. McCoy's gang was already on the move, and John sensed that San Eladio would be taken by the next morning. The town would be ravaged, its inhabitants killed or forced to surrender. There was no escape. John stood on the orphanage porch, his gaze lost on the horizon, where darkness began to swallow the day. Abigail approached, her steps firm, but her face marked with concern. She wasn't afraid of Vince McCoy, but she knew the danger was not just physical. The real battle was happening inside John. He tried to hide the tension, but she knew him well enough to sense the anguish he carried. "You're thinking about what to do, aren't you?" she asked, stopping beside him, her tone calm but laden with something more. Understanding, perhaps. She knew John was wrestling with the weight of his past, but she also knew he could no longer keep running. John sighed, his gaze empty and distant. "If I could, Abigail, I would go back to the mountains and stay there alone without anyone knowing about me. But the town is in danger, and Vince will never leave me in peace. He will destroy everything if he's not stopped." Abigail looked at him, her blue eyes shining with rare intensity. "You're not alone anymore, John. And Vince has no power over what you choose to be. Only you can decide which path to take." But he knew her words, comforting as they were, weren't enough to erase the pain and the ghosts he carried. The past was there, lurking, ready to collect its dues. "You're right. I've decided I can't keep living in hiding." That night, John prepared for the confrontation. He put on his old leather jacket, the same one he wore when he was a gunslinger, and strapped the gun to his belt. The weight of the pistol felt familiar, as if it had been made for him, but at the same time, it felt like a burden. He didn't want to be the man who pulled the trigger easily anymore. Abigail, although visibly distressed, didn't try to dissuade him. She knew John's choice was made. "You'll need more than courage to face Vince," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "You'll need something you've never had before. Support, not just yours, but the town's." Deep down, John knew she was right. If he wanted to win, he couldn't fight alone. But what he didn't know was whether the people of San Eladio would be willing to trust someone with the past he carried. He had always been a fugitive, a bandit, and now, trying to do the right thing, he wondered if anyone would believe in his transformation. As he pondered this, the sound of distant hooves began to echo down the deserted street. The tension in the air became palpable. The first signs of the storm were approaching. McCoy and his men were coming. In the distance, the lights of the city began to shine, a fragile beacon against the growing darkness. John knew that the battle to come would be about more than just bullets and gunpowder. It would be a fight for the very soul of San Eladio, a struggle to determine whether they would be swallowed by violence or if they could, together, rise up against the forces trying to destroy everything good that remained. McCoy's men arrived in large numbers, mounted on their horses and armed to the teeth. They stopped at the entrance of the town, forming a menacing line. The main street was empty, except for the few residents who dared to look out from their windows. Vince was at the front of the group, a smug smile plastered on his face. He knew the town was terrified, and that gave him a cruel satisfaction. John and Abigail stood at the door of the orphanage, now ready to face whatever came. But to John's surprise, more figures began to emerge onto the streets, the residents of San Eladio. They were armed with whatever they could find: machetes, rifles, old pistols, and even makeshift spears. Among them were Sheriff Teddy Hawk and other men who, although they lacked the training of a professional gunslinger, were willing to fight. The entire town was rising up. It was not just a fight against McCoy, but a fight for dignity, for the morality of a town that refused to be overtaken by fear and violence. John felt a wave of emotion that he did not expect. The truth was that no matter how much the past haunted him, he was no longer alone. He had never been. "Let's do this," John said to Abigail, his voice steady but filled with contained tension. He did not know how things would end, but he was ready to fight for the only thing he knew to be true: San Eladio. Vince McCoy smiled as he saw the resistance rise. He did not believe for a second that a bunch of civilians with their makeshift weapons could challenge him. He was used to seeing towns submit to his command. But something was different in San Eladio. The people were determined to fight for their lives, for their families, for their town. McCoy approached, stopping a few meters from the defensive line formed by the citizens. He dismounted from his horse, staring at John with a challenging gaze. "You think you can stop what is inevitable? I own this place, Black. I always have." John stepped forward, hand on his pistol, but his voice was firm. "You may have controlled the town for a while, Vince. But today, it will prove that we are no longer willing to live under your command, and if it takes fighting to the last man, we will do it." McCoy looked at the men accompanying him, assessing the scene. The town was determined, and John Black seemed more resolute than he had ever imagined. McCoy might have his power and strength, but now he faced something much greater: the courage of a united town. The wind blew fiercely, lifting the dust from the main street of San Eladio, as if the sky itself were witnessing the impending confrontation. Night had fallen, but the tension in the town was more intense than ever. The street lamps flickered in the shadows, creating a surreal and threatening scene, as if the very spirits of the desert were watching the struggle for survival that was about to unfold. John was at the front line, alongside Abigail, Sheriff Teddy Hawk, and several other men and women who had gathered to face Vince McCoy's gang. They were all armed with whatever they could find: rusty pistols, old rifles, axes, and machetes. There was no trained army waiting, but rather a united town, determined to protect what remained of their way of life. Vince McCoy, with his group of gunslingers, stood a few meters away in silence. He looked at the residents of San Eladio with disdain, as if it were only a matter of time before the town surrendered to him. His arrogant smile did not fade, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of concern. He knew that John Black was no longer the same man he used to be, but he also knew that a golden opportunity was presenting itself. McCoy had never lost a fight. "So, John Black," McCoy said, breaking the silence, "do you really believe this town will rise against me? You are just one man, and I have more than 20 with me. There's no chance." John, standing firm in his position, looked at the man who had once been his leader. The memory of the betrayals and past crimes consumed him for a moment, but he did not let it shake him. "Maybe you have more men, McCoy," he said, his voice deep and calm, "but I have something you will never have: the loyalty of those who have something to lose, and the courage of those who know what it is to live without anything." Abigail, standing beside John, said nothing. She knew he was ready, even if his heart was heavy. She had seen the ghosts he carried, the scars of a man who lived on the fringes of society. But she also knew that deep down, he was ready to be the man he had always needed to be. The John Black who could redeem himself not with words, but with actions. Vince let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Loyalty? Courage? That won't save your skin, friend. You're a criminal. Always have been. You're just trying to hide that under this good guy facade." He gestured to his men. "Let's finish this quickly, and let the city understand that no one escapes the consequences." And then, as a signal to start, the first shot was fired. The sound of a gunshot echoed down the street, shattering the quiet of the night. The battle was on. John jumped behind a pillar, immediately taking cover. Sheriff Teddy Hawk and the other townsfolk followed his lead, doing their best to shield themselves and shoot accurately. But McCoy's men were not willing to give an inch. They were outnumbered and had more combat experience, making the confrontation brutal. The sound of gunfire mixed with the thunder of hooves as the outlaws charged toward the defensive line. John knew time was short. They had to hold out, but they were aware that the town had few options left. "Abigail, get inside!" John shouted as a bullet whizzed past his head. "It's too dangerous here. I don't want you to get hurt." She looked at him with a determined expression. "I'm not hiding, John. The children need me here. I'm with you." Abigail, her expression fierce, crouched low and ran into the orphanage, positioning herself near the windows where she could see the street and assist in the defense with the few weapons they had. Her presence in the defensive line was not merely symbolic. It represented the town's determination not to succumb. Meanwhile, John and the others held the line. He moved quickly, using his experience as a gunslinger to take down two of McCoy's thugs with precise shots. Every movement he made was calculated, every decision careful. He was leading, perhaps for the first time in his life, with more than just violence. He was fighting for something greater. Suddenly a scream cut through the air. Teddy Hawk, the sheriff, was lying on the ground, a bullet through his shoulder. John saw the sheriff fall, and his reaction was immediate. He rushed to Teddy, crouching down and pulling him behind an improvised barricade. "Stay with the town, Teddy!" John shouted as he applied pressure to the sheriff's wound to staunch the bleeding. "I won't let this end like this." Teddy, his face pale, nodded weakly. "Go, John. The town needs you." But his words were faint and the pain was evident on his face. As John stood up to continue fighting, an explosion shook the ground. One of the outlaws had thrown a homemade bomb near the main barricade, forcing the townsfolk to retreat for a moment. Dust and fire began to engulf the street, making the scene even more chaotic and deadly. The moment of decision had arrived. John had to choose. The fire was spreading, and the chances of victory were dwindling rapidly. McCoy had seen the vulnerability and was now advancing, leading his group with greater fury. He wanted to see John fall, and there was nothing that could stop him unless John made a decision that would change everything. Hearing the sound of hooves and the shouts of the outlaws, John made a choice. He looked at Abigail, who was at the orphanage window, shooting skillfully. She was not only protecting the children, but also fighting for the town. With a determined look, John gestured. He ran into the street, grabbed a rifle left by one of the fallen, and took a precise shot at the leader of the outlaws. McCoy stopped for a moment, surprised. John Black was not just defending himself, he was attacking with a new purpose. "This is the end, McCoy!" John shouted as he advanced, the fury of the desert burning in his eyes. The battle was far from won, but a new wave of confidence swept through the townsfolk. The fight was not just against the gunslingers, but against fear, against the past that John carried. He was no longer running. He was no longer being dragged by fate. He was doing what was right, fighting for something greater. The confrontation was in full swing, but it was already evident that the tide was changing. John, with his decisions and courage, was inspiring the town, and the resistance was becoming fiercer. The battle was still not won, but the heart of the storm was in its final moments. The weight of John's past, the mistakes made, no longer defined him. He had something to protect, not just his life, but the life of the town that now believed in him. With McCoy wounded and the fight intensifying, John knew that the future of San Eladio was at stake. The true struggle for redemption was about to begin. The main street of San Eladio was engulfed in smoke and the deafening sound of gunfire and explosions. The battle seemed to be dragging on, but something in the air indicated that the end was near. Fire was consuming the stalls and buildings around, and the town, once peaceful, now seemed on the brink of collapse. But John Black was no longer afraid. He knew that this confrontation would be the key to his redemption or his ultimate destruction. Vince McCoy was still there, leading his gang with the same cruelty as always. But now, something was different. The man who once seemed invincible was starting to realize that his authority was not absolute. The residents of San Eladio, led by John, were resisting. The courage he had instilled in the townspeople was now transforming into a true army. They were willing to fight to the last man to protect what was theirs, and McCoy knew he could not underestimate them. John had become the man he always knew he could be, not the ruthless criminal McCoy wanted to see, but a leader, someone willing to risk everything for a greater cause. The battlefield was in chaos. Abigail, along with the other residents, was behind an improvised barricade, shooting accurately at the approaching bandits. She didn't hesitate, her courage reflecting the confidence John had placed in her, and that she now felt for herself. Teddy Hawk, the sheriff, although wounded, was at the center of the defense line, instructing others and doing what he could to keep the bandits at bay. But what John knew he needed to do was confront McCoy. The battle was at its peak, and he understood that a final victory would only come if he destroyed the leader of the gang. Vince McCoy was not just a physical enemy, he represented what John feared most, the man he could have become if he hadn't chosen to fight for something greater. To defeat him, John needed to be not only quick with a gun, but also strong enough to face his own demons. With a determination he hadn't felt in a long time, John rose from behind a pillar and moved toward Vince. The sound of hooves on the asphalt and the smell of gunpowder mingled as he approached. McCoy was ahead, surrounded by some of his men, all armed to the teeth. The leader smiled as he saw John coming closer. "Do you really think you can defeat me, Black?" McCoy said with a sarcastic laugh. He still maintained his confidence, but his eyes revealed a hint of doubt. He knew that if John faced him face to face, it would be a fight to the end. "You've always been just a fugitive, a man without honor. Do you think you can change that now? All you are, John, is a shadow of what you could have been." John stepped forward, the weight of the gun in his hand, and the answer was clear. "I am no longer who you think I am, McCoy. I am the man who will put an end to this." The sound of the first shot echoed through the town, followed by the crack of a bullet grazing the side of a building. McCoy fired quickly, but John was more focused. He dodged, spinning behind a wooden barrel, and shot back. The confrontation between the two was quick and relentless. McCoy was desperate to end it, while John moved with the precision of someone who had lived a life of violence, but now fought with more than just anger. He was fighting with the desire to protect those who believed in him. McCoy fell back for a moment, trying to buy time to reposition himself, but it was in that moment that John saw a window of opportunity. He stood from his cover and advanced, hitting two precise shots that took down McCoy's supporting men. McCoy, now isolated, realized the tide had turned. "I won't let you leave here, McCoy," John shouted, aiming his gun directly at the man's chest. The rage and frustration of years of criminal life were concentrated in that moment. It was now or never. Vince McCoy, sweating and with eyes full of fury, looked at John, and for a second he seemed to hesitate. But like a cornered animal, McCoy attempted one last move, pulling a knife and lunging to attack. The move was quick, but John was ready. In an instant, McCoy's blade was stopped by the end of John's gun, which fired again, this time hitting McCoy in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. "You've lost, Vince." John's voice was low and definitive. He was exhausted, but there was no more doubt in his heart. He had won the internal battle that had always haunted him. McCoy tried to get up, but John didn't move. He knew that the fight wouldn't end with the leader's defeat. The town still needed to be rebuilt. However, the battle had been won. With the gang leader defeated, McCoy's men began to scatter, realizing that the resistance of San Eladio was not something easily broken. Many fled, while others were captured by the town. The victory was not clean, and the town lay in ruins, but there was something undeniable in the air. The feeling that, finally, San Eladio had become more than just a piece of land in the desert. The town had become a symbol of resistance, courage, and a new chance for those willing to fight. When the last of the bandits fled, Abigail ran to John, who still had the pistol in hand, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but a look of satisfaction on his face. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and he looked at her, his tired eyes now filled with gratitude and love. "You did this, John. Abigail said, her voice soft but full of emotion. The town is yours now, not just for your fight, but for your decision. You chose to be the man you've always wanted to be. John looked at her, a sad smile forming on his face. Victory won't erase what I've done, Abigail, but for you, for them, for everyone who believed in me, I'll try to be worthy of this. He gazed at the city. San Eladio, though destroyed, was still alive. There was life, there was hope, and that was the true victory. The final battle was John's true test of character. It wasn't just a fight against McCoy, but against the man he could have been, against his own mistakes and the weight of his past. By defeating Vince and leading the city's resistance, John not only saved San Eladio, but also achieved his redemption. The future of the town was now in the hands of its residents, and John's, alongside Abigail, finally seemed free from the chains of the past. The storm had finally passed, and the sun began to rise over the ruins of San Eladio. What seemed to be the end was, in fact, just the beginning. The first light of dawn began to pierce through the smoke and debris of San Eladio, illuminating a desolate scene. The streets, once full of life, were now covered in rubble and traces of fire. The sound of battle had ceased, but the roar of explosions still echoed in the minds of the inhabitants. The victory was bittersweet, and the scars of war were everywhere, both on the damaged buildings and in the hearts of the survivors. John Black stood in the middle of the main street looking toward the horizon. His clothes were torn, his body dirty with dust and blood, but his eyes carried a quiet resolve. The battle with Vince McCoy was over, but the real work was just beginning. San Eladio would need much more than mere material reconstruction. It would need a new spirit, a new way of living, and perhaps that would start with him. John, Abigail's voice interrupted him. She was by his side, gazing at the ruins with a sad yet determined look. Her hair was dirty and tangled, and her clothes were also marked by the fighting, but she stood firm. The town is hurt, but it is alive. We cannot let it be lost now. John looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew Abigail's words were true, but the weight of what had happened still consumed him. I know, Abigail, he replied, his voice grave, but I don't know where to start. I've caused so much suffering in my life. How can I rebuild this? She stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. We can't change the past, John. No one can, but you have something now that you never had before, the chance to make a difference. And that's already more than many can say. You don't have to do this alone. Rebuilding the town would not be a simple task, but what had happened in the last hours in San Eladio had changed everything. The inhabitants, who had once been divided, were now united. They had faced fear and oppression, and in the end they had won. Not just the battle against McCoy, but the battle for their own lives and for freedom. The morning after the battle, the residents gathered in the main square. The sky was clear and the sun was shining, but the scene around them was desolate. Still, there was something new in the air, a sense of purpose, of hope, that began to replace the devastation. John stood before the citizens, with Abigail by his side and Teddy Hawk, the sheriff, still recovering in the background. The scars of battle were on everyone, but there was something more in their eyes. A renewed fire, the flame of determination. San Eladio is not defeated, John began, his voice firm yet full of emotion. We faced death and destruction, but here we are. The town may be fallen, but hope stands tall. What happened here united us in a way that even Vince McCoy could not destroy. And together we will rebuild what we lost. Not just the houses and businesses. We will rebuild our faith in each other. There was silence in the air, but it was a silence of expectation, of acceptance. The looks that may have once been suspicious or cynical were now filled with respect. John Black, the fugitive, the criminal, was now standing there as a leader. And no one doubted his determination anymore. Let's start with what we have. The town needs work, food, shelter, but above all, it needs unity, John continued. And I am the first to offer help, whatever it may take. We rebuild together or we rebuild nothing. The applause was timid at first, but soon grew stronger. The town was with him. San Eladio, with all its ghosts and past mistakes, was determined to move forward. The victory in the battle against McCoy had been important, but what lay ahead would be much more challenging. The reconstruction of the town's spirit and the lives of its people. Abigail's journey was also beginning to change. Once, she had been a simple teacher caring for the children, but now she was a pillar of the community. She was not only one of John's closest allies, but also a voice of reason and compassion for the town. Her role in the future of San Eladio would be crucial. "John, we cannot forget the wounded and the families who lost everything," Abigail said, looking at the group gathering around John. "And we need to ensure that the children are all right, that they feel safe again. We cannot let fear define them." She was right. The children were the future of the town, and John and Abigail knew that true reconstruction would begin with them, not just with the physical work of rebuilding, but also with restoring trust and emotional security. Teddy Hawk, for his part, now had a new purpose. Although he was injured, his experience as sheriff was more important than ever. He began organizing security patrols to ensure that peace was maintained in San Eladio, that any remaining bandits were expelled, and that the law was upheld. However, Teddy's authority now came from the trust the town had in him, not just from his position. As the weeks passed, the town slowly began to rebuild. Houses and businesses were repaired, crops started to grow again, and the local market resumed operations. But true reconstruction was not just physical. San Eladio was healing, not only from the wounds of battle, but also from the emotional traumas caused by fear and oppression. John felt a transformation within himself, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. He was helping, but more than that, he was learning to forgive himself. The man he had been, the outlaw, the fugitive, the gunslinger, seemed to be slowly dissolving. He felt as if he were finally taking ownership of the new life he had always desired, but thought was impossible to achieve. One afternoon, when work was quieter, John and Abigail walked through the rebuilt streets of San Eladio, talking about the future. John looked at her and said, with a tired but genuine smile, "I never thought I would reach this point. I never thought I could be who I am today." Abigail looked back at him, her eyes shining with deep understanding. "You weren't the only one, John. We are all learning to be better than we were. San Eladio will be proof that the past doesn't have to define who we are. We have the power to change." As the sun began to set on the horizon, tinting the sky with gold, San Eladio appeared to be a renewed place, not only in physical terms, but spiritually as well. People were united, and there was a growing sense of community, a feeling that despite the difficulties, the town now had something it had never had before, the certainty that together they could face any challenge. John Black, the man who had once been the heartless gunslinger, was now the leader of the town. He had found his redemption, not in words or empty promises, but in actions. And more importantly, he had learned to forgive himself. As he looked at the faces of the citizens beginning to rebuild their homes, John smiled, knowing that San Eladio was in good hands, no longer as the fugitive of the past, but as the man who had finally found his true home. The reconstruction of San Eladio was much more than just rebuilding buildings and land. It was a healing process, both for the town and for John Black. He redeemed himself not only in Abigail's eyes, but in the eyes of all who now saw him as a true leader. The past he carried, filled with crimes and regrets, was finally left behind. The true battle was not against Vince McCoy, but against the very shadows that still haunted his soul. And in the end, he won, not just through his actions, but by becoming the person he had always wanted to be. Mornings in San Eladio had never been so calm and serene. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky with a soft golden hue as the first rays of light touched the cold, parched earth of the desert. The scars of battle were still present. The marks of fire, the damaged houses, the square where the bodies of Vince McCoy and his men had been left. But with time, San Eladio began to heal. John Black walked through the streets of the town with a sense of peace he never thought possible. It was a simple yet profound peace, as if he had finally found a purpose greater than the shadows that haunted him. The town was standing again, but more importantly, he now had something that once seemed unattainable, a legacy. "It's different, isn't it?" Abigail asked as she approached John. She was beside a small child, a girl with brown hair who, in the past, would have been terrified by the sound of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder, but now she smiled as she played in the street. She was a symbol of everything John had fought to protect. John looked around, observing the citizens of San Eladio working together to repair the last damages. The market was already bustling with life, with people buying and selling goods, and laughter could even be heard from a community breakfast being prepared in the town square. "Yeah," he replied with a genuine smile, though still somewhat tired. "It's different. I never thought I'd see anything like this." "You did this, John," Abigail said, her voice soft yet full of certainty. "The city, the life the people have now, all of this, it's thanks to you." He shook his head, looking at her with a wistful smile. "It wasn't just me, Abigail. It was all of us. If I've learned anything, it's that none of this would have been possible without each one of us. Without the courage of the people who were willing to fight for a better tomorrow." Deep down in his soul, John knew he had changed. The man who had arrived in San Eladio, fleeing a dark and bloody past, was very different from the one walking the streets now. He no longer feared looking at himself in the mirror. He no longer saw himself as the fugitive or the gunslinger. The John Black of now was a man with responsibilities, someone who had learned the value of life, peace, and community. The inhabitants of San Eladio, who had initially been suspicious of his leadership, now saw him as a symbol of redemption. He had become something more than just a leader. He had become a guardian of what the city represented, a new chance for everyone, not just for him. Abigail, with her unwavering patience and confidence, had been his greatest ally. She knew John carried a heavy burden, but she also knew he had within him the potential for true change. Together, they not only helped to rebuild the walls of the city, but also created something that could never be destroyed, a true community united by faith in the future. As they walked together down the main street, passing familiar faces, John couldn't help but feel a slight relief. The war he had fought was not just against McCoy's men or against fate itself. The real battle had been against his own demons. With stability restored, the city began to thrive in a way it never had before. People were returning to the fields, local trade was flourishing, and for the first time in a long time, San Eladio was becoming a place of hope. Teddy Hawk, although still recovering from his battle wounds, had taken on a new role as head of security, now with everyone's support. Law and order had been restored, and the remaining bandits had either fled or surrendered. And perhaps most impressively, the fear had vanished. The people no longer looked back at McCoy's reign of terror, nor did they fear that the next criminal would take the town. They had united in such a way that solidarity had become the most powerful weapon against any threat. John, in his new role as leader, knew that the greatest challenge was still ahead, ensuring the city remained at peace. But he was prepared. He had learned throughout his journey that leading was not about being the strongest or most imposing, but about being able to listen, to understand, and to make difficult decisions for the good of all. He knew that his greatest mission now would be to be a beacon of justice and integrity for others. When night fell, the city gathered for a simple yet meaningful celebration. The tables were filled with food, children played around the campfire, and adults conversed animatedly. It was a scene of unity, prosperity, and, most importantly, renewed hope. John and Abigail sat together at one of the tables, watching the joy around them. For the first time, he felt that he had finally found a place where he felt at peace. San Eladio was now his home, and he was no longer fleeing from his past, but walking toward the future. "You have a good vision, John," Abigail said, looking at him with an affectionate smile. You know, sometimes I wonder what would have become of us if you hadn't come here." He looked at her, his eyes soft and a slight smile on his lips. "I was running away, Abigail, but I found what I was really looking for, a purpose. And that purpose, well, it brought me here." She smiled and held his hand. "You didn't just find a purpose, John. You found a family." John leaned back in his chair, looking up at the starry sky above them, feeling a peace he had never imagined feeling. The cycle was complete. The new dawn for San Eladio was not just a metaphor for the city's future. It was also the conclusion of John Black's journey, a man who had been lost in the shadows and was now finding his light. The outcome for San Eladio was not merely a material reconstruction or a simple military victory. It was a profound transformation, both for the city and for John Black. He found his redemption by facing his past and choosing to be someone different, someone capable of leading and creating a legacy of peace. The city was now a reflection of John's journey, renewed, strong, and ready for the future. San Eladio had transformed from a city plagued by fear and violence into a symbol of hope and unity. And somehow, that man who had once been the solitary gunslinger had become the soul of San Eladio, not by the strength of arms, but by the strength of his inner change. John Black's legacy, now recognized by all, was clear. True strength comes from learning to be human, from rebuilding, and from looking to the future with confidence. We've reached the end of this epic journey of redemption, courage, and overcoming. What did you think of John Black's transformation and that of San Eladio? Like the video if you loved this story, comment on what moved you the most, and share with your friends so more people can experience this adventure with us. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. Your support makes all the difference, and together we will continue bringing epic content to you. Like, comment, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.